The room was silent until the folder slid across the table. A red seal glared from the page like a warning, and the man in the tailored suit spoke only 5 words that could destroy everything Javier Méndez had built. "Explain this or we walk." Millions hung in the balance. The investor's eyes were cold, the accusations heavier than the polished wood beneath Javier's hands. He knew the truth, but in that moment, truth alone wasn't enough. And then, from the corner of the room, a voice broke through in perfect Arabic. It belonged not to a lawyer, not to a business partner, but to the delivery girl. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished wood, but to Javier Méndez, it felt more like the inside of a pressure chamber. Sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows of his Mexico City office, glinting off the sleek conference table. Every inch of the space had been prepared for this moment, the most important meeting of his career. For weeks, he had studied financial projections until his eyes ached, memorized market data until he could recite it in his sleep, and rehearsed his pitch in front of anyone willing to listen. Today was supposed to be the day all that effort paid off. 2 of the most influential Arab investors in the energy and logistics sector had flown halfway across the world to meet him. If they agreed to his proposal, his company would leap from a promising local player to an international contender overnight. But as the meeting unfolded, that dream began to crack. One of the men, the older of the 2, clearly the leader, sat with his back straight, his dark suit perfectly tailored, his expression carved from stone. He turned the pages of Javier's proposal slowly, eyes scanning each line with surgical precision. The other investor, younger but no less imposing, remained quiet, occasionally exchanging brief, pointed glances with his partner. The air was thick with unspoken judgment. When the leader finally looked up, his voice was low, deliberate, and edged with finality. "I do not think," he said in accented Spanish, "that this project is what we are looking for." The words landed like a heavy gavel on Javier's chest. Still, he tried to fight back, laying out numbers, growth charts, expansion strategies, anything that could shift their perspective. But the more he spoke, the more he felt the ground slipping beneath him. These men were used to dealing with billion-dollar corporations, with fleets of lawyers and decades of proven international dominance. To them, Javier's company, though agile, passionate, and deeply committed to quality, might have seemed like a candle trying to compete with the sun. Then came the sound that would change everything. A soft knock. The door opened. Mariana stepped in, unaware she had just walked into the heart of a crumbling negotiation. She wore her red delivery uniform, a thermal backpack slung over one shoulder. Her hair was tied back, a few loose strands framing her face. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the suits, the polished table, the tension hanging like fog. She froze for a moment, long enough for Javier to wonder why she wasn't backing out. Then, in an act that seemed both unplanned and inevitable, she stepped forward. Her gaze locked on the older investor. And then, in flawless Arabic, she spoke. The words were simple, but they cut through the air like a blade. "I know why this deal makes sense for you." Javier blinked. The younger investor's eyebrows rose. The leader's dark eyes narrowed, the corner of his mouth tightening, not in anger but in curiosity. Mariana's voice carried the confidence of someone who was not just repeating memorized lines, but speaking from lived truth. She had spent years in the Middle East before returning to Mexico, and her pronunciation bore the mark of genuine experience. She began to talk about the company, not with the clinical detachment of a salesperson, but with the warmth of someone who had seen it breathe and grow from the inside. She told them about the loyalty of its employees, about how Javier treated the smallest delivery as seriously as the largest corporate order. She painted pictures of customers whose fortunes had changed because an urgent shipment arrived exactly when it was needed. The investors who moments ago had seemed ready to leave, now leaned slightly forward. The young one tilted his head as though trying to catch every syllable. The leader studied her with the focus of a man recalibrating his assumptions. Javier sat silent, torn between astonishment and caution. He had not planned for this, had not even known Mariana could speak Arabic. But the shift in the room was undeniable. Mariana spoke of the warehouse worker who, after losing his previous job, found purpose and stability in Javier's company. She described a client whose entire contract with a European partner had hinged on receiving a shipment within 24 hours, a delivery she herself had completed, weaving through traffic, refusing to stop even when the rain turned the streets into rivers. Her words peeled away layers of skepticism from the investors' faces. They no longer saw a mid-sized Mexican business. They saw a company with human resilience woven into its foundation. But just as momentum seemed to tilt in Javier's favor, the door opened again. An assistant entered, carrying a dark leather folder embossed with gold. He approached the leader, murmuring in Arabic, his tone urgent. The leader's brows furrowed. He opened the folder, scanned a page, then closed it with deliberate slowness. When he spoke again, his voice was sharper. There is information here I do not like. He slid the folder across the table to Javier. Inside was a report stamped with a red seal Javier had never seen before. The document accused his company of failing to deliver a critical order to a client in Dubai, an error that allegedly caused millions in losses. Javier's stomach nodded. We have never operated in Dubai, he said quickly. This must be a mistake. The leader gave a humorless smile, the kind that suggested he had heard such claims before. How can we trust you will not make such a mistake with us? The young investor leaned forward, his tone cooler now. You ask us to risk our name and money. But this shows why we should not. Mariana's hands tightened at her sides. She remembered a supplier they had cut ties with months ago, an intermediary whose negligence had cost smaller clients dearly. It was possible, she realized, that someone was using the company's name without permission. The leader tapped the table. We do not have time for excuses. Convince us now or the meeting ends. Silence pressed in from all sides. Javier glanced at his notes, but there was nothing there that could disprove the document in front of him. Years of work, of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and personal risk threatened to collapse in this single moment. That was when Mariana stepped forward again. Her voice was steady. You want certainty, not promises, she said in Arabic. Give me 5 minutes. I can prove this report is a manipulation. The leader studied her for a moment that felt like an hour. Finally he nodded. 5 minutes. Mariana pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved quickly, scrolling through saved emails, old contracts, and archived messages. She had kept everything: years of delivery logs, supplier correspondence, and even signed termination letters. Within minutes she found it. A contract termination notice, signed and dated, severing ties with the very supplier who had caused trouble. Attached were emails confirming the supplier had attempted to operate under a misleadingly similar name. She handed the documents, first to the leader's assistant, so he could verify the seals and dates, and waited. The assistant read them, his expression shifting from skepticism to acknowledgement. He murmured to the leader, who raised his eyes to Mariana again. From there, the balance began to change. Javier, seizing the moment, explained how they had implemented strict safeguards after that incident, ensuring no external partner could misuse their identity again. The young investor nodded slowly, his earlier stiffness giving way to interest. The leader remained silent for a long stretch, studying Javier. Then he said, Not every leader allows someone else to speak for them. You trust your people. That tells me something important about your company. The room seemed to exhale. The conversation turned constructive. The investors began asking questions about expansion strategies, potential adaptations for Middle Eastern markets, and timelines for rollout. They were no longer seeking reasons to walk away, they were looking for reasons to start. By the end, the leader stood, extended his hand to Javier and said, Deal. And I hope this woman remains in your company, because with people like her, success is certain. Days later, Javier called Mariana into his office. The contract, the largest in the company's history, had been signed. You did not just save a deal, he told her. You saved years of work. You saved an entire company. He offered her a permanent role. Coordinator of International Relations. Mariana accepted, not for the title, but because she believed in what the company stood for. The investors even sent her a personal letter of recognition, praising her intelligence, composure, and loyalty. And Javier learned a truth that would stay with him forever. Sometimes, the person who changes the course of your future is the one you least expect. And when trust is repaid with action, it becomes the strongest currency in any business. The story of that morning did not begin in the boardroom. It began long before the investors even set foot in Mexico City. For Javier Méndez, the weeks leading up to this meeting were a whirlwind of preparation and quiet anxiety. He was not born into wealth. His father had been a mechanic, his mother a schoolteacher. From them, he inherited discipline and an unshakable work ethic, but also the knowledge that opportunities like this did not come twice. He had built his company from scratch, starting with a single delivery van and a laptop that overheated if left on too long. In the early days he had been the driver, the customer service rep, the accountant, and the janitor all in one. Years later he had a fleet, a small office, and a team he trusted, people like Mariana. Mariana had joined almost by accident. A friend told her about a temporary delivery job while she was in between translating contracts for a law firm. At first she thought it would just be a way to pay the bills. But over time she realized Javier ran his business differently. Here no one was invisible. Every employee mattered. And so she stayed. When the invitation from the Arab investors arrived, Javier knew it was a test of everything he had built. These men were known for precision and for expecting flawless execution. They could smell weakness in a proposal the way a seasoned chef could smell a spoiled ingredient. The morning of the meeting, Javier woke before dawn. The city outside was still dark, the streetlights casting pale halos on wet pavement. He ironed his suit twice, even though it already had no creases. He rehearsed his opening lines in the mirror, watching his own eyes to see if they carried the conviction he felt. By the time the investors arrived, he had convinced himself that the hard part was over. All that remained was to present the truth of his company's value. But confidence can be fragile. Inside the boardroom, the rhythm of the conversation faltered almost immediately. The investors were polite but distant, speaking in short sentences, their eyes moving over his documents but rarely meeting his gaze. The leader, tall, with silver at his temples and a voice that carried quiet authority, radiated the kind of control that made people sit straighter without realizing it. When he finally said, "I do not think this project is what we are looking for," the sentence did not just threaten the deal, it cut into Javier's belief that he belonged in that room at all. Still, he pressed on, showing charts that proved year-on-year growth, explaining how they could expand into regions underserved by major competitors. But their expressions did not change. It was like trying to light a fire in the rain. The knock on the door was almost a relief, a break in the monotony of rejection. But when the door opened and Mariana stepped in, Javier's relief turned to worry. She was carrying a delivery bag, her cheeks flushed from the brisk walk up the stairs. She froze for a moment, clearly realizing she had walked into something important. But instead of stepping back out, she took a breath, stepped forward, and spoke in a language Javier could not understand, but the investors could. Her Arabic was fluid, elegant, and confident. And from the way the leader's eyes sharpened, Javier knew she had struck a nerve. In the minutes that followed, Mariana spoke with a conviction that could not be faked. She did not talk about market penetration or strategic leverage, she spoke about human stories. She told them of a small medical clinic in a remote town that had nearly run out of life-saving supplies during a flood. The shipment had been delayed by washed-out roads, but the company had rerouted drivers, sending 2 vans through muddy back roads just to make sure those supplies arrived before dawn. She spoke of a bakery whose survival depended on fresh ingredients arriving daily, and how Javier's team had driven through the night when a supplier failed to deliver on time. Each story was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry of reliability and dedication. The leader listened without interrupting. The younger investor leaned in, elbows on the table now. Even Javier, though still bewildered, could feel the energy in the room shifting. But then the door opened again. The assistant stepped in, folder in hand, his expression a mix of urgency and gravity. He spoke in rapid Arabic to the leader, who listened without moving. Then, without looking at Javier, the leader slid the folder across the table. The accusation inside was a snake, coiled and waiting to strike. A supposed failure in Dubai. A claim of millions lost. A red seal from an international body. Javier's denial was immediate. "We have never done business in Dubai." But his words fell into the silence like stones into deep water, heard but swallowed. The leader's gaze was cold. "How do we know it will not happen with us?" Mariana felt her own pulse quicken. She knew Javier was telling the truth. She also knew that, without proof, truth could be powerless in a room like this. She stepped forward again, asking for 5 minutes. And when the leader gave them to her, she moved with the precision of someone who understood the stakes. Her phone became her weapon. She scrolled through years of archived messages, digging into the memory of every past problem, every supplier they had ever let go. She found it, the contract termination notice, the evidence of fraud by the supplier who had once betrayed them. Emails confirming that the supplier had operated under a deceptively similar name. When she presented them, she did it with strategy. Not straight to the leader, but to his assistant first, in Arabic, ensuring the verification came from someone the leader already trusted. The shift was almost imperceptible at first. The younger investor's lips pressed together, then eased. The leader's fingers stopped drumming on the table. Javier filled in the rest, explaining the safeguards they had put in place, how no partner could ever again misuse their identity. The leader studied them both for a long moment before saying, "You trust your people enough to let them speak for you. That is rare. And valuable." From there the meeting turned. Questions flowed, not about whether to invest but about how soon they could begin. By the end, the handshake came with a sentence Javier would never forget. "Deal." And I hope this woman stays in your company. With people like her, success is certain. When Javier called Mariana into his office days later, the weight of the signed contract sat on his desk like a crown. You saved the deal, he told her. You saved the company. He offered her the role of coordinator of international relations. She accepted, not for the title but because she believed in the mission. The investors sent a personal letter, praising her intelligence and courage. And in the quiet after they left, Javier realized something he would carry for the rest of his career. The greatest assets a company can have are not its products, its branding, or even its strategy, but the people who will stand up and fight for it when the moment comes. Years before she walked into that boardroom, Mariana had stood under the blazing sun of a Middle Eastern port city, watching ships the size of buildings glide into the harbor. Her father had worked for an international shipping company, and their family had spent years moving between cities in Oman, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. In that time she had absorbed more than just the language. She learned the rhythms of the markets, the cadence of formal greetings, the subtle hierarchy in a business conversation where a single wrong word could close doors forever. Her best friend during those years was the daughter of a local merchant, a girl named Layla, who taught her the phrases that could disarm an argument or soften a refusal. Mariana didn't know it back then, but she was training for the moment that would define her career. When she first heard the investors' voices in the conference room, she recognized the same formal tone she'd heard in her father's meetings overseas. It wasn't just about the numbers, it was about trust, about whether the person sitting across the table understood more than the surface of a deal. That was why she hadn't stepped back when she entered the room. She knew she had something Javier didn't, a bridge across the cultural gap that was quietly undermining his pitch. The leader sat like a judge at the head of the table, his broad hands resting on the leather-bound folder, the silver strands in his hair catching the light. The younger investor kept his eyes on Javier, but his mind seemed to be elsewhere, already picturing the flight home without a signed agreement. When the red-sealed report was placed on the table, the energy shifted. It wasn't just bad news, it was an accusation. In some business cultures, such a document was not a question but a declaration of guilt. Javier's denial was logical, but logic could not erase the symbol of that red seal. When Mariana asked for 5 minutes, Javier's heart sank. 5 minutes could be salvation or humiliation. If she failed, it would confirm the investor's doubts. She began to search through her phone like a codebreaker working against a ticking clock. Every second was a pulse in the air. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of a leather chair. She found the email chain, the scanned letter, the stamped confirmation of contract termination. But even that wasn't enough. In the culture she had grown up around, evidence meant little unless it came from someone already trusted. That was why she handed the documents first to the leader's assistant. In Arabic, she explained every line, every date, every seal. The assistant's eyes narrowed at first, then widened slightly. He nodded. That small motion broke the stalemate. The leader addressed her directly, now in Arabic. What makes you so certain you speak the truth? Her reply came without hesitation. Because this company did not just hire me. It gave me a home. And I do not defend a home with lies. It was an answer that resonated far beyond the facts. Honor was a currency the investors valued above all else. The rest of the meeting unfolded like a slow sunrise. Where there had been shadows, light began to seep in. The questions became practical, collaborative. The deal that had been seconds from collapse began to take shape in the open air. When the handshake came, it was not a cold formality. It was the clasp of two men who now saw each other as allies. The signing ceremony was small but symbolic. The investors requested that Mariana be present at the table, seated between them and Javier. In the photo that would later hang in Javier's office, she was smiling, but her eyes carried the weight of the moment. Javier kept his promise to elevate her, giving her a title and responsibilities that matched the loyalty she had shown. But more than that, he gave her authority, the kind that meant her voice would always be heard, not just when a crisis demanded it. One evening, long after the papers were signed and the excitement had faded, Javier stood by his office window, looking out at the city. The lights below blinked like stars caught in glass. He thought about how close he had come to losing it all, and how the person who saved him had once been just the delivery girl. It humbled him. Mariana, for her part, never once bragged about what happened. When colleagues asked about the meeting, she would simply smile and say, "We got the deal." But in the private corners of her mind, she knew it had been more than a deal. It had been a moment when all the scattered pieces of her past, her years in the Middle East, her time on the streets making deliveries, her quiet observation of how people treat one another, had come together in a single, decisive act. In business, numbers can open doors, but it is people who keep them open. And sometimes, the bridge between collapse and victory is built in a language you didn't even know you needed.